Time has expired unless there are further. Mr. Bishop, do you wish to be recognized?
I do. I thought you're not going? Okay. Yeah, I do. Madam Chairman, I want to speak on the amendment. Am I recognized to do that?
Yes, you are.
I did want to further the comments that the ranking member made first on the subject that the gentlelady from Pennsylvania remarkably suggested, that if she could find concern for domestic victims' rights on this side of the aisle, she would be relieved. And of course, this amendment is about concern for victims of domestic violence. That's the premise of it's the very core of the amendment. But last week, I guess it was last week, I lose track, the Democrats defeated an amendment from Mr. Massey to permit victims of domestic violence a special dispensation from otherwise what was going to be a ban on classes of weapons in common use, mostly semi-automatic center-fired rifles. And Mr. Massey had an amendment to allow, well, let's let domestic violence victims have that dispensation. Of course, that was rejected. Remember, the chairman memorably spoke to it, said he didn't think that it was good for anybody to be able to defend themselves from domestic violence with such a weapon. And then 2 weeks ago, or maybe 3, there was the Democrats' grab bag of gun control, gun grab measures, and one of those was a new straw purchase provision. Mr. Massey offered an amendment for an exception to that also, so that if a neighbor taking pity on a battered wife were to buy a gun for her, give it to her, and if she were to receive it, they would both be criminals under the Democrats' law. He offered an amendment to at least take those poor victims out, and all those that wear the concern for domestic violence victims on their sleeves couldn't do that. So I'm not sure that the gentlelady is looking in the right direction when she finds the absence of concern for victims of domestic violence. But let me also speak to something else that this amendment brings to the fore. And I got a chance briefly to ask the chairman, Ms. Lofgren, about so remember the hypothetical is the non-citizen former member of the military who's been convicted of domestic violence for beating his wife, but he found that he was beating his wife when he woke up. He found himself, I think he said he woke up to find himself beating his wife, or assaulting his wife. Now, okay, and Mr. Tiffany appropriately pointed out, if it were an involuntary act for real, then he's not guilty. And Mr. Buck confirmed that. I'd say something else. I don't believe him. I'd put it that way. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, stepping on anybody's toes about PTSD. I don't believe you choke your wife while you're asleep when you got domestic violence. But I got to say this. One of the principles of a system of justice is finality. And so what we build discretion into the process, and then at some point in time, you've had your bite at the apple, there's finality. It works both ways. You can't be held in double jeopardy for a crime, be convicted or prosecuted multiple times. It works the other. If you bring a lawsuit, your claim is precluded. You got to bring everything in one lawsuit, or your claim is precluded. Well, here there are multiple stages for the exercise of discretion. First, the victim, who he probably told that he didn't know he was choking her, but he was having PTSD, and she didn't believe him. Apparently, that's why she brought him in. She exercised discretion, and then a prosecutor exercised discretion and said, no, we're prosecuting you. And he was convicted. And then there was another stage for discretion to be exercised because there was an immigration judge that entered a removal order. And the United States, the Attorney General was represented in that process, and that Attorney General's representative could exercise discretion. Discretion was exercised again, and they decided to remove that person from the United States. And so now, what is proposed is a new measure to allow discretion to be exercised again. And all Mr. Tiffany's asking in this amendment is say, well, maybe before he gets discretion exercised in his favor a fourth time, the victim ought to be considered the first time. That's all this amendment does. And I cannot imagine anyone who would have the brass to sit over there and say there's no concern for domestic violence victims here and vote this amendment down. Let's watch. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back to additional individuals. I think we have had a series of votes called on the House floor. If there's additional members who wish to debate this amendment, I think we'll have to recess and return after votes. House is in recess and stands in